ABCT, it's fine. Okay, Harry. If you can introduce yourself, please.
All right, my name is Harry Garuba. I teach at the Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town. I have a joint appointment with the English department, so I teach courses on African literature and culture in the English department also.
In brief, why is it important that we study Africa in a particular way, or in a different way?
Well, see, Africa has always had a fascination for different groups of people, philosophers, explorers, entrepreneurs, slave traders, and what have you. And all of these people come to Africa, as it were, with different interests. And most of the archive of representations that we have on Africa are things that portray Africa as different. In fact, we can say that the organizing metaphor for representations of Africa is the idea of difference. And that difference from the norm is taken sometimes to extremes. When the classical Roman philosopher elder, Pliny the Elder, said that out of Africa comes always something new, people have always interpreted that as meaning that something new comes from Africa. But new in the sense that Pliny was using it was not new in the sense we use the word now in terms of innovative, cutting edge, at the frontier of things. It basically meant different, surprising, stunningly different from the kinds of things that happen in other parts of the world. So the idea of Africa has been marked by difference from everything else, has always been at the core of representations of Africa. And what we try to do when we say you need to study Africa differently is to say that these representations come from certain kinds of perspectives and interests, and that being located in Africa, living an African reality, gives you a different perspective on things that allows you to reorganize, to rethink and reconfigure the whole intellectual archive of representations of Africa. And that is what we try to do in some of our courses in African studies. We try to look at films that represent Africa, galleries that represent Africa, texts, travel book brochures, tourist books, and we analyze them and look at the ways in which they represent Africa. And very often we find that this idea of difference is at the heart of it. And lately there have been two very important movements in the representation of Africa. Some refer to one as Afro-Romanticism, where in fact what you try to focus on is beautiful landscapes, wildlife, in fact something that shows a pristine beauty. Another perspective is what is often referred to as Afro-pessimism, which focuses on wars, on farming, on starving children, on orphans and child soldiers and so on. So between these tropes of Afro-romanticism and Afro-pessimism lies a truth about Africa that is often not explored. And that truth is what we try to explore when we say you have to think Africa differently.
Speak to me a little bit about the work. You're a poet.
Yes.
Yes, and I will include that Guardian article in this.
Thank you.
Speak to me a little bit about that poem.
Well, what I was trying to explore in that poem, it's a poem about living home at the age of 10, going to boarding school. And the boarding school that I attended actually tried to cleanse you in a sense of your Africanness, to cleanse you of your language, because we're not allowed to speak languages that were regarded or referred to as vernaculars. So you only had to speak English. And so in the 5 years of living in that boarding house and in that school, what they were actually trying to do was to create a new subject. And in the language we use these days, you say a subject of Englishness. That English becomes the language through which you think, through which you view the world, through which you do everything. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with that if you're an Englishman. But if you come from a culture and a country that has other forms of knowledges, other languages, other ways of seeing the world, what then happens is that these languages, these ways of seeing the world, these other knowledges that had been in your body, that you had grown up with as part of your lived experience, suddenly become suppressed and subjugated and denigrated. So you begin to think of them as somewhat inferior. And that's where the problem really lies, because you see, an openness to other forms of knowledge, other languages, other ways of conceiving things is at the root of knowledge production. But once you have a dominant hegemonic system that suppresses everything else, what you have is a monochromic view of the world.
Can you speak to us a little bit about the juncture between modernity and coloniality, and how where Africa sits with this, and how on the one hand we're not seen as modern, but on the other hand how modernity and coloniality are entrenched?
Well, yes. In fact, the very self-constitution of modernity was to weed out all of those who were considered non-modern. But colonialism and, of course, capitalism, trade, brought modernity to parts of the world that were considered pre-modern or non-modern. And what has happened is that we're struggling at every point to see how these, if you like, new subjects of modernity, who were supposed not to be modern, how they are adapting, how they are, if you like, assimilating. And of course, that's the wrong lens to use, because it is important to understand that modernity and coloniality were two angles of the same thing. That, in fact, it is not simply that modernity impacted on other parts of the world, it impacted in the form of a certain coloniality which affected the way the economics do. In fact, very subjectivity of peoples in other parts of the world. Because as I just said in the previous thing, what happens is that you begin to denigrate, you begin to look down upon all the things that are yours. And you're epistemically tied to a new way of looking at the world. So first of all, you are epistemically disenfranchised, and then epistemically captured to a new way of looking at the world. And part of the things that decolonial scholars have tried to do is to say that it's possible to disengage from that kind of epistemic capture and think the world through other lenses.
The word look comes up a lot in your comments. How do you think Africa and African bodies are looked at and seen and understood? You hinted a little bit towards difference and lacking, and here I go to Fanon's writing around black bodies. For the purpose of this brief interview, can you just elaborate on your thoughts on that, and how black bodies in Africa, and in fact, if we can extend it then to the diaspora, how we are seen and looked at and then understood?
Yeah, in fact, that's a very interesting question, because there is in fact a history that encapsulates this, and it always comes up at this university in the statue of Sarah Backman. Sarah Backman, the woman taken from here and exhibited all over Europe and was dissected at her death, and all of these scientific experiments. So in her body comes together not just the fact of difference, of lack, of of abnormality, if you like, but also the collusion of institutions of knowledge, such as museums, such as science, all centered upon creating a certain form of knowledge about this particular body. Now, that historical moment, in a sense, has welled on into the present. I was once told that there was an American football coach, American football, who said that his team was not performing well because they didn't have black players. Now, no matter how well intentioned the statement was, it feeds into a discourse of black bodies as spectacle, as being, athletic, as being, you know, all brawn and all, not exactly brain. And the ways in which black bodies are portrayed, um, not just in the media, in advertising, in all spheres of knowledge production, creates a certain image of blackness as something slightly off center. And that has been, predominantly, the major trope for the representation of black bodies. And, I was looking at the first few pages of a book recently. I think the title of the book is Algorithms of Oppression. And it starts off by saying, do a Google search of black woman and see what you see. And you see, it's not just the fact that all of the images you see conform to these tropes that we're talking about, but that if you did an opposite search, a Google search of white woman, other kinds of things come up entirely. And so the idea that certain kinds of things are definitive of blackness is one of those ideas that has persisted. I started with Sarah Batman, but people are sometimes horrified these days to say, oh, did they really do that? But all they need to do is look at media images, look at commentaries on Africa, and they'll see that there are other ways that these things have been reproduced in the present.
Can you give us your thinking on why this matters right now in a larger global framework? Why does it matter now?
Oh, I think it absolutely matters at this moment more than it did a couple of years ago. You see, it was easy to understand colonialism, physical conquest, physical domination. But lately, the narrative that was taking over the world was globalization, inclusiveness, and so on and so forth, until the migrant crisis erupted in Europe. And all new kinds of right-wing organizations are taking over the world. And their views of the world are xenophobic, they're racist, they're, fundamentalists in various senses. So religious fundamentalism of a Christian sort, the idea that, everyone who comes in, who is different from us, comes to contaminate, the pure society, the pure culture that we have. These ideas are rising at very alarming rates all over the world. And this is why it matters, because once you portray people as different, once you portray them as less than human, that allows you to do all kinds of things to them. It gives you a license. And that license is what is being exploited. Even though these images have existed for a long time, this is the crucial moment where that license, has been given to people to basically come out and express the worst in themselves and make it mainstream. And from the US to Eastern Europe to Western Europe, all of the things you hear these days are nationalism and a fear of the other, and a description of the other in terms that are dehumanizing.
and I should ask this question right at the beginning, the link between slavery, racial slavery, and colonialism, and the emergence then of the black body, or the link between colonialism coming after slavery, racial slavery, and how it legitimizes this conquest. And if we can speak to some, I mean, it's a vast continent. So for the sake of brevity, what this conquest looked like in Africa. I mean, perhaps from the country from which you're at, from which you're from. If you can talk to us about that.
You see, in the southern part of Africa, for example, I mean, people still speak about the genocide of the Harris. And there were all kinds of genocidal practices that accompanied colonialism from the Americas to Africa. But what was really interesting about colonization after the abolition of slavery was that while there was a recognition that the enslavement of human beings, that kind of physical enslavement, was not something we could do anymore, what it then moved towards was a different kind of enslavement, which was colonial enslavement. And colonial enslavement often justified itself by saying that it was a civilizing mission. Now we recognize that these people are human, but they are a little at a certain stage of humanity, so we need to move them up to become like us. And that's the whole idea of the civilizing mission. And again, it provided the kind of license that allowed people to commit all forms of atrocities, because, you know, it's for the good of the people. We're trying to make them better human beings. We're trying to make them economically modern. We're trying to make sure that they wear clothes. We're trying to make sure that they understand that gold is what moves the world. So these new kinds of oppression were not much different from racial oppression and racial slavery, but this time they could be quoted in the idea of the civilizing mission and the idea of upliftment of the other populations of the world.
How, again, to respond to Fanon, where he talks about in Black Skin, White Masks, about make me a free man or something like that. It's one thing, for those who are not African to see us in a different way, but for Africans themselves to see ourselves in a different way, kind of an emancipation of the mind, because we always see the remains within Africa itself that our benchmark, our measure, sits elsewhere. Yeah. What are the mechanisms that we can do that you think? How do we enter those difficult spaces where we can do that?
You know, one of the really fascinating things about Fanon was that he always thought that there was the opportunity that racism, colonialism could always be transcended. And his basic call was for a new humanity. But you see, because of centuries of interpellation, of thinking that, the measure of everything good is Europe, very often Africans themselves measure themselves against the standards of Europe, when what actually they should be doing is really interrogating the standards in respect of their own realities and crafting, as Fanon says, a new humanity, a new set of standards that are not oppressive. Because, as we all know, most of the period of the Enlightenment in Europe, of the call for democracy and freedom and human rights, these were going on at the same time that those advocates of freedom were busy enslaving people. They didn't see any contradiction between enslaving others and calling for freedom. People tend to forget that the American Revolution, the French Revolution, was happening at about the same time that the Haitian Revolution was happening. And all of the major thinkers in Europe at that time could not understand the idea of slaves asking for freedom. And not just simply asking for freedom, they went a step further to ask for autonomy and sovereignty, to create their own nation state. Remember, this was late, 18th and 19th century, and the idea of nation states for colonized people didn't take off till the 20th century. So even when slaves were thinking the same abstract thoughts about freedom, about democracy, about self-determination, the people who were at the forefront of calling for self-determination for themselves could not recognize that these other groups of people could have the same kinds of thoughts or ideas. And that's one of the major tragedies of the world, that what some people are calling for and want for themselves, they can't think of it as something